With most kids heading back to school now, it's natural for us to kind of turn our attention to how kids are doing. And one way that we do that is through assessments, whether that's through studies or through report cards. But what if the report cards or the assessments or even the studies are trying to gauge something that might not necessarily be helpful for how the kids are doing and might actually be more affirming an idea that parents might have or teachers or adults might have about learning? Well, today in the Celebrate Kids podcast, in our daily segment, Face in the Dark, we're going to talk about this. How do we gauge our kids well? And what do we do when the culture of society places different gauges or different assessments on kids, maybe in an effort to kind of control outcomes? We're going to turn to Dr. Kathy now for some insight.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is going to guide you, baby. Not every light is going to guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, a recent randomized controlled trial that was conducted in Chicago explored the benefits of math apps on early learners' math skills. It aimed to close the cognitive development gap between high and low-income families. The trial involved children ages 3 to 5 from low-income families and revealed that using vetted math applications on different devices resulted in significant math skills improvements, even outperforming the effects of a year in the Head Start program, while also enhancing parent-child interactions and made learning more efficient. Dr. Kathy, when I see studies like this, I'm kind of challenged to think of the effects of these studies. We kind of look at them maybe in this age group, and then maybe we extrapolate out, maybe we should do this for other people. And we kind of step outside of maybe the different realities that were kind of controlled inside of these studies. And it can kind of change behavior. What is it about a study of kids that are ages 3 to 5 years old in kind of low income situations that we need to understand before we go out and kind of all buy our kids iPads and download all the education apps that we can find? What do we need to kind of learn here?
I love that question because, I'm not a strong fan of teaching children this age with apps on devices. I do appreciate that in this study, they vetted the math apps. So that the fact that they include that detail encourages me, that they were looking for, applications on devices that had maybe the right repetition and the right developmental speed of learning things, all that. That's really good. I'm going to say this, my friend, doing anything in low-income families is going to show gain. Anything. They could have done flashcards. They could have done, go to the park and, count, how many swing sets there are. They could have done anything to invest in children from low-income situations and engaging parent-child, and there would have been an improvement. The fact that they use apps is because we live in the day and the age that we have. So what I would learn from this is spend time with, one-on-one, your little kids, talking about and learning and doing and using the skills that you want them to learn, whether it's the ABCs or the 1, 2, 3s.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's something that I'm kind of like gleaning from this a little bit too. But I'd like to have you kind of explain some things inside of this specific age group, because I think it's natural for kids ages 3 to 5 to be a little bit kind of sponges when you're talking about really foundational kind of language-based, whatever, math perspectives, right? They're forming the vocabulary of math. They're understanding how math kind of in some ways might relate to the world, but they're really building a lot of kind of the fundamental building blocks for that language in mathematics. So by teaching them that math is a kind of language, they're really kind of ready to master that because they're learning other dynamics inside of language and vocabulary and things anyway. What I'd like to hear you kind of speak to, though, is that next stage of development. What are the understandings of development that we need to have as we kind of guide and prepare our kids for all of the kind of training and learning that they're going to develop, especially when we look at kind of this foundational stage from 3 to 5? But then when they kind of get into that stage of 6 to 10 or 6 to 12, what are the realities that we need to know about this idea of learning and how does it kind of translate for us as parents?
Well, that's great. I haven't thought about some of this in ages. To our listeners, we do not script these. Well, you script your side. I'm like flying blind here, which is really fun. I actually love recording these with you. I wonder if you'll keep that comment on the broadcast. We'll have to see. What comes to my mind is moving from us facilitating their learning to them learning on their own. setting the table and accidentally counting the number of forks they're putting out, not meaning to, but not being able to not do it. Being able to, go to the store and count how many tires are on the grocery cart or whatever. So they figure some things out on their own. They begin to memorize as part of development. So how do we teach truth? And then how do we facilitate memorization, repetition? How do they decide that memorization will help them? And the most important thing for me is that we get to the stage of application. I think the earlier we help kids understand that we learn it to use it, the better. That's part of our purpose. And so I'm not learning how to read just so that I can read. I'm learning how to read so I can read to someone else and bless their day, right? I'm learning mathematics so that someday I can have a ministry or a career that might use, mathematics and numbers. And I know that if they're 3 years old, that's a long way away. But the earlier that they understand that there's a usefulness to this, the better, because that's what cements it in our mind as having value. And that's what motivates us independently of any adult standing over our shoulder with a whip.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's important to think through. I remember having a math teacher when I was in, geometry and algebra 2, and she would kind of say, these are really hard things. You might never learn this, but you're building muscles to solve big problems. And so for me, I was thinking, can't we just solve somebody else's real world problem and not somebody's made up X problem? But at the same time, that's what we were kind of in. And with that, I kind of want to dive into this topic. When we look at school, we kind of maybe sometimes expect our kids to kind of be good at most things, most everything at least that they're getting graded on, right? We want them to kind of come home with A's or A's and B's, or, for my parents, it was a little bit more like A's, B's, and C's, and let's see how you do. And then you get like freedom based on that. And there was kind of this drive for us to kind of push. And a lot of my feeling of success was kind of based on that report cards kind of drove how I was actually kind of doing in school. And so academic progress kind of ended up driving things. And so if I was struggling in a class and was having a hard time understanding some things, or maybe I was struggling in a class and others were just better than me, and it might have been graded on a curve, I kind of felt like, man, I just don't feel like I'm getting graded or I'm getting kind of assessed appropriately for how I'm kind of feel like I'm doing in school. What do report cards or grades, or even like in this study where they're kind of charting, academic progress, they're kind of charting it based on something that they've determined as is something that's valuable. How much stock should we kind of place in report cards and gauging academic progress? What does that kind of idea actually show? And how can, as parents, we have a good outlook on this as we're walking with our kids through school and kind of helping them learn?
Interesting. I believe that report cards I think grades recorded on report cards indicate where our kids stand in light of other kids. It's supposed to be an independent, like I'm going to grade junior based on junior. But in reality, in many cases, it's junior based on the other 23 kids in the class. Because if these 5 kids are super excellent, junior just didn't quite make that cut, so he's going to be excellent. If those 5 kids weren't in the class, he would have been the top of the class, he would have been super excellent. So we have to understand as parents that there's a little bit of fakeness there. And I would also say that it is supposedly an indication of how they're progressing. Do they start out with satisfactory earlier in the year and excellent later on? Praise God. It's hard work for teachers to be objective and to take the time to evaluate. I think I would say respectfully that any parent who is surprised by a child's grade, how would I finish that sentence? I want to say shame on you, but I don't like shaming people. But what I mean, I tell teachers all the time that if you give an assessment and you're surprised by how they do, you shouldn't be. You're the teacher. You should know whether the assessment was even necessary for them or you to figure out who was not able to retain information and who was. If you're a parent paying attention to daily work and emptying the backpack and talking with your kids about what they're doing in school, and they're coming to you enthusiastic about a report and scared about a test, then when you get that, quarterly report or whatever, you shouldn't be surprised. And I congratulate those parents who are that invested, to not, so that they're not surprised. And to our homeschool parents who are listening, let me just affirm you do not need to grade your kids. You are with your children. You know how they're doing, from point A to point B to point C. And it's okay to not evaluate in the traditional sense. They need to know if they're meeting standards. They need to know if you're pleased or not. That's part of life. And they'll know that by the way that you're interacting with them.
As Dr. Kathy closes here, there's a verse out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that came to mind. This is what's written in 1 Corinthians 3, beginning at verse 13. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold or silver, costly stones, wood or hay or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. This passage came to mind partly because this is a call from Paul to church leaders to build on the foundation of Jesus Christ. But he did it with this understanding that there's going to be a test. There's a test that comes to kind of gauge the solidity and the strength of the work that these church leaders are doing to build the faith in the people that they're mentoring and discipling. And I think as we take stock of the different gauges and tests and different things that are coming out in the world, as Dr. Kathy alluded to, it's important for us to take a pause and to gauge out those things that really are going to stand the test of time, and to build first on those, to build confidence, to be involved in people's lives, to disciple and mentor. I think those habits are the things that, as Dr. Kathy said at the beginning of the show, are the things that really are going to win the day. And I think what this study shows, as we talked about earlier, is really that we just need to spend time with people. We need to be like Christ in coming down into brokenness and being involved in the restoration work that God is doing in that situation. And I think doing that is going to be a bright light that shines through the darkest times and even the toughest tests. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this daily segment, Face in the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and I want to say thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.